Welcome to Patent Behavior Bytes Coffee Break. The mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, PATN, is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. Our goal for each child is to ensure individualized education program teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. Today's Behavior Bite will focus on social-emotional learning. We will cover what is SEL, benefits of SEL, implementing SEL, and finally, SEL in practice. So, what is social-emotional learning? Social and emotional learning, or SEL, is an integral part of education and human development. SEL is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. Additionally, SEL advances educational equity and excellence through authentic school-family community partnerships to establish learning environments and experiences that feature trusting and collaborative relationships, rigorous and meaningful curriculum and instruction, and ongoing evaluation. SEL can help address various forms of inequity and empower young people and adults to co-create thriving schools and contribute to safe, healthy, and just communities. So when you're considering adopting a SEL program, please remember that you should be intentional and have a plan for implementation, that it should be systemic, so throughout the building and hopefully the district and community. Consider what all humans need to know to be successful, and finally, learning self-awareness to move towards both self-efficacy and self-advocacy. So let's consider benefits of SEL. Based upon a meta-analysis of the research, it was found that implementing an SEL program led to improvement in student social-emotional skills, grades, relationships, perception of school, a decline in student anxiety, behavior issues, and substance use. A long-term impact was seen up to 18 years later. And finally, there was an 11-to-1 fiscal return on investment. Social-emotional learning benefits everyone, including students, teachers, administrators, and families. Many of you may already be implementing a PBIS or MTSS behavior framework, and we want you to know that SEL fits beautifully into an existing framework. Both approaches are proactive and based upon positive reinforcement rather than punitive consequences. Student voice and family engagement are both central to success. And you can also connect SEL implementation to academic successes. So while there are many similarities, there are also some differences between SEL and PBIS. So with SEL, the goals are more lifelong social-emotional development of competencies and utilizes a specific curriculum or programming and practices based upon specific SEL competencies. Whereas the PBIS goals are more positive behavior choices in the moment. It may involve lesson plans, but it's based upon observable behavioral expectations coupled with a school-wide acknowledgement system and other components that make up the PBIS framework. The most important thing to remember about PBIS and SEL is that it's not an either-or situation. SEL can comfortably be situated within a PBIS or MTSS framework and can be part of your Tier 1 or part of a Tier 2 or Tier 3 level of support. Now that we've talked a little bit about what SEL is, now let's talk about implementing. The Castle Guide to Schoolwide SEL can lead school teams through a process for a systemic SEL implementation. You can see the link to the Schoolwide Guide on the slide at schoolwideguide.castle.org/how-it-works. Let's take a brief moment and consider how to measure your building's Schoolwide SEL. It's best practice to use a measurement tool no matter where you are in your journey. If you are just getting started or already have SEL practices or programs in place, be sure you are using a tool to measure and guide you towards fidelity. In other words, using this guide provides your team with measurement and action items towards strategic school-wide SEL. The use of this guide will build your team's confidence around what they are doing, where they are going, and how they will get there. If your team is already ready to begin their journey towards strategic implementation, it's recommended that you could use this guide to support your assessment of where you are now and action plan towards where you want to be. The Castle Guide to Schoolwide SEL takes your team through these 5 focus areas across 3 steps, from organizing to implementing to improving. For more on how to get started and how to get better, you can use the link you see here. In the end, the tool you select to measure your student competencies should be scientifically sound, feasible to use, and actionable. Educators can further narrow their list of competencies on which to focus based on several other possible inputs, including but not limited to existing state or district SEL standards or learning goals, stakeholder feedback and input, including input from teachers, parents, and the community, the needs of the student body. It's also important to consider whether potential target SEL competencies are meaningful, meaning having an impact on long-term student outcomes, measurable, can it be assessed in a school setting, and malleable, can it be developed in a school setting? So let's think about installing SEL curriculum within the framework of PBIS. So we know that PBIS is comprised of systems, using data to support decision making, and considering practices that support student behavior. So our first step is to consider, what does our data say? So we might be looking at community demographic information, screening information, attendance patterns, discipline patterns, etc. And based on a summary of those data, we could fill in the blank to this sentence. The most significant concern is blank, defined as, and we want to make sure this is an operational definition that we can see, hear, and count, that is taking place most often, in what location. The behavior occurs, so we want to have a frequency or quantity of behavior so that we can set goals, and is most likely to happen. It can be a time of day, students from maybe a specific group of students or a grade level, or it could be the entire student body, or most frequently engaging in the problem behavior, and this may be due to X. So considering what might be contributing factors to the behavior or the function of the behaviors that we are seeing with our data. The next step is to create a goal. So you can create a SMART goal, and we want to have a goal so that when we are collecting data on student progress, we will know when it is no longer a problem for our system. So that's why goals are important at this step. And then next, what are we going to do to support the students' behavior and provide necessary skills in order for students to understand how to regulate their emotions, and skills to manage stress and anxiety? So what also can we do to promote predictable, positive, safe, and consistent environments by developing caring connections through relationships between adults and students and between students. How can we teach expectations, including teaching of replacement skills in conjunction to the use of an acknowledgement system. And then finally, thinking about social emotional competency, how do we teach staff to the knowledge to teach the necessary skills for students? How do we support staff to implement the program with fidelity? So we might want to consider the development of professional learning communities to support adults as they are developing their own skills and practices in order to support students. And then finally, how do we collect and use data to monitor progress both towards our goal and to look at fidelity of implementation so that we can continuously improve the program? So when you're thinking about adoption of SEL, your Tier 1 or leadership team uses community and school data to assess the needs of young people within your school community, and together as an integrated team select evidence-based practices that match the needs that have been identified through the data. So you don't have to necessarily purchase a prepackaged program or curriculum, but you do need to invest in a process for that selection based on need to determine what students need to learn and how best you can teach those skills. As your leadership team is considering potential data sources, look at the list below and think about who in your building might have access to these various sources of data, and consider how you can use these data to identify possible skills or needs for your students in thinking about the connection to an SEL program. After your teams have taken the time to select data, you can start to sort groups of students by need or other factors that may impact groupings, such as age and gender. So you might have groups based on depression, anxiety, extremely elevated depression, extremely elevated anxiety, by externalizing risks or adaptive skills risks. You can also consider the number of students who are impacted with your data. So if there are large groups of students who are impacted, it might be best to consider school-wide adoption of SEL programs. And then for smaller groups of students, they might need supplemental support in small groups at Tier 2. And for our most needy students, we might need to do something more individualized at a Tier 3 level of support. Strong SEL implementation will help students develop their skills with targeted instruction and structured supports. Students develop SEL skills in conjunction with academic skills. So let's finish out this brief behavior bite with a few key points around SEL and practice. One of the focus areas when implementing school-wide SEL is to strengthen adult social-emotional learning. There are 4 sound reasons for assuring that energies are placed in this focus area. First, the more that leaders across the central office understand the practices and benefits of SEL, the better able they'll be to promote and sustain systemic SEL implementation district-wide. This ensures that SEL is not siloed into a single department or viewed as a standalone initiative, but instead ingrained into all of the district's work. Secondly, effective professional learning ensures that educators and staff in the district understand what SEL is, how building adult and student SEL competencies support critical long-term outcomes for students, and what strategies they can implement to achieve this goal. The third rationale for encouraging a focus on adult SEL is that staff not only need opportunities to learn about the research and practices behind SEL, but also to critically reflect on and deepen their own social, emotional, and cultural competencies. This may include examining their own sociocultural identities and biases, strengthening their ability to empathize and take on perspectives of those who are different than them, practicing skills to help build their relationships with students and staff, and assessing how their actions impact equitable outcomes. Finally, communities of adults who know and trust one another and who are skilled at working together towards shared goals are more successful in implementing, improving, and sustaining SEL. Throughout the SEL roadmap, each of the 4 critical practices feature activities. Each activity concludes with a list of curated tools to help operationalize the guidance within that section. While this may sound complicated, check it out for sure. The ideas and activities featured here could serve as a robust PLC for your staff or a subgroup of staff. As an example, one of the activities that is featured under Critical Practice 1 is the use of two-way communication strategies. When putting your school-wide SEL into action, we need to remember this very important point: to embed SEL across the curriculum. SEL principles taught to students will not gain traction unless adults in the school can integrate them into daily practices and capitalize on real-life situations that demand their application. It's important to understand the various types of SEL groups that might be put into place within your context, and they range from basic to complex. By making decisions as a systems team about structures, skills to be taught, provider, location, and frequency, you will naturally be putting the group someplace on this continuum. A group that takes place weekly will be less intense than daily. A group led by a clinician such as a school counselor or a school psychologist will be more intense than one led by a classroom teacher. These are rules that will of course have exceptions, but they will help guide you in the process of creating a continuum of options to support your students. Just as teachers discovered ways to deliver content area instruction in the arena of remote learning, there are many ways to embed SEL into remote instruction and learning every day. Not drastically different from what you would do in the classroom, except we know that when we have zero physical proximity with our students, it can be very difficult to gauge their social-emotional well-being. It is also difficult to monitor other social platforms for which they may be using to make or break social mores with their peers. Regardless, there are still opportunities for embedding real-time SEL instruction across the remote learning school day. Be sure your team protects time to tie down logistics within your school-wide SEL planning. For example, you can use explicit emotional check-ins using barometer ratings such as thumbs up, thumbs down, or so-so. Incorporate it into a story time or reflection of characters within a novel. You can also utilize it during journal prompts, role-playing, morning meetings, etc. These are some of the references used to inform this technical assistance behavior guide. We hope that the materials provided to you today will help build your confidence and energize your teams towards implementing and measuring your school-wide SEL. Thank you for taking time to learn more about SEL and SEL implementation. Please remember, this is just a bite of behavior, and we'll see you next time.